Hi everyone, welcome to today's informational webinar about the current state of cybersecurity. There is quite a lot to talk about. I'm sure if you guys have been watching the news at all, you've seen some recent events that probably have you a little scared. We're going to talk a little bit about that and talk about what's coming next. The agenda for today, I'm going to introduce myself, Paul Caiazzo. I'm going to talk about my company TruShield and what it is that we do. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about current events, some of those kind of headline-grabbing events that have happened recently, which probably brought you to this webinar. We're going to talk about how we got here. What are the sequence of events or issues that arrived, that developed to cause the situation we're currently in, and then a little bit of look forward of where we're going in the realm of cybersecurity and how we can better protect ourselves going forward. So again, I hope you guys get some useful information out of this, and there will be some time for questions towards the end. Okay, so I'm Paul Caiazzo. I am the co-founder of TruShield. I've got about 17 years of experience in information security. I've got a variety of certifications and a master's degree in information security and assurance. My background's primarily technical, so I've seen everything from network engineering all the way up to security engineering and penetration testing, and pretty much everything in between. So that gives me, I think, a pretty good frame of reference for what it is we're going to discuss today. If you're interested in reaching out to me, you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn or at my email address there. LinkedIn we're fairly active on, so I would suggest that if you're interested in cybersecurity, you do follow us on LinkedIn, either myself directly or our company TruShield. We post informational stuff there pretty frequently around threats and, again, current events that are happening in cybersecurity. Feel free to reach out. I love taking questions, so anytime you've got something that's stumping you, just give me a shout. So TruShield, I founded TruShield with a business partner in 2008. We're based in Washington, D.C., and have pretty great access to the federal government and all of the resources that come with that, including U.S. CERT, so threat intelligence sources and things along those lines. We started out doing professional services and consulting around things like penetration testing, risk assessment, security consulting, and architecture, and things like that. I've personally performed hundreds of penetration tests and done some consulting at some pretty large government organizations, as well as a fair number of financial institutions, healthcare organizations, and law firms. That really currently serves a pretty significant book of our business. However, we also have a managed services platform wherein we do 24/7 monitoring and alerting via our CSM platform. Only interesting because that means we have a pretty good insight into what's actually happening in the world right now and what challenges people are facing, as well as what the threat actors are doing, what the bad guys are trying to do to you so that you can better protect yourself. If you have an interest in any of these services, feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk to you. So I'm going to dive right in about current events. Again, you probably have seen some headlines very recently around things like ransomware, or if you were following the political cycles around state-sponsored hacking of organizations like the Democratic National Committee, and more recently, even some voter information was exposed. So there's a lot going on in the world right now, and some of it is, it's kind of frightening. It definitely keeps me up at night because, of course, we have to protect our clients, and that's a pretty hard job sometimes, and I'm going to talk about why. So it's a fairly scary world out there, and you do have reason to be worried. If you saw last week, or I'm sorry, a couple weeks ago, WannaCry, a ransomware outbreak that affected something like a couple 100,000 machines around the world, and it spread pretty quickly. Ransomware is everywhere right now, and if you haven't seen ransomware in your environment yet, you're lucky, and it's probably only a matter of time before that actually gets to you. If you're not familiar with the term ransomware, that's the kind of weaponized cyber attack wherein all of your files get encrypted or locked, and you have no way of getting them back without forking over a ransom to the bad guys. Not cool, and unfortunately, not every time that you pay that ransom, they actually give you the data back. One thing I find really interesting about the ransomware is that since it's so prolific, and if you don't have good backups that you can restore to prior to the incident, even the FBI recommends that you pay the ransom, which again is kind of scary to me. Crimeware and botnets. Crimeware is along the same lines. It's organized crime, largely perpetrated from Eastern Europe and Russia specifically, that's focused on monetizing cyber attacks, really on generating business or generating money, and it's a multi-billion-dollar business for those guys that they're able to either steal information from their victims and sell it on the black market, or just simply gain access to the computers and use those as resources for things like denial of service attacks to somebody else. In 2016, there were only 1,093 breaches reported, but I promise you that's nowhere near the actual number. It's just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of this stuff goes unreported. And if you're listening along today, I'd imagine you have an interest in cybersecurity. Have you guys had an incident in your environment? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe I don't know is the right answer. And I think actually it's far more likely the answer to be I don't know. The reason is because it takes about 200 days for an organization to realize that they've had a data breach. 200 days, that's almost 7 months. That really scares the heck out of me because I know, what sort of damage I could do to an environment in 7 months if I had, free access, free reign to do whatever I wanted. But the question that should beg, if it takes 7 months to detect that you've been breached, what's going on in those 7 months, and why are we not able to actually detect that? I mean, you're thinking to yourself, we spent money on firewalls, we spent money on antivirus, but we still aren't able to detect this sort of thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why that is and what we could maybe do differently. Some other statistics here which really jump off the page to me. The average cost of a single data breach is around $4 million to U.S. businesses. $4 million. So think back to that last slide. There were over 1,000 data breaches that were reported. The average cost being $4 million per, that's $4 billion right there. That was lost just in the reported incidents. And again, remember that's the tip of the iceberg. 4 out of 5, fully 80% of organizations are unaware that they've been breached until they've been notified by law enforcement. So what that means is, for those 210 days, you're sitting there wondering, whether or not you got breached. You get a phone call or an email or a knock on the door, and it's an FBI agent telling you that your information's out there on the dark web, or they found some attack traffic coming from your network because you were breached and your machines were used against somebody else. That's 4 out of 5 times that's what happens. Less than 20% of the organizations are actually able to see anything themselves. So if you think the average amount of time it takes for a company to realize it's been breached is 210 days, and 80% of the world can't even tell that they've been breached, they have to rely upon law enforcement to tell them that, then, again, you have a reason to be worried. It's a scary world out there. Less than 10% or 9% of organizations are actually satisfied with their incident response capabilities. And the picture that this should paint right here is if it takes 210 days to realize we've been breached, it's going to cost me $4 million, and I'm only going to be able to tell I've been breached maybe 1 out of 5 times, then I better have a really good incident response capability, or I better be able to very quickly contain and eradicate any sort of cyber threat on my network. And unfortunately, less than 10% of organizations are actually in that position. Again, that should be scary. If it's not scary to you, then hopefully you've got, maybe you're in that 9% that has the good incident response capabilities. If not, you better start working on it right now. Think about developing an incident response plan, and not just develop it, but actually test it. And if you need some help with that, you can, again, feel free to reach out to us. I want to talk also about the lifetime or the life cycle of a data breach, because I think this really helps paint the picture of what actually happens during a data breach. So let's say we had a data breach on today, June 29th. The breach actually starts today. Now think back, it's going to take me almost 210 days to figure out that I've been breached, so I'm not going to know for quite some time. However, the bad guys are actually able to steal the majority of data within a couple of hours. So 60% of your data is gone within a couple hours of that initial incident. So again, if you think about that, if it's going to take me months and they've stolen my data within a couple of hours, then I'm so far off the mark, it's almost laughable if it weren't such sensitive data. So then it takes several more months. Over 50% of breaches take months to be discovered. So several more months before you've actually realized that the data is gone. And at that point, your hair's on fire. You're trying to figure out what the heck do I do? How do I get the data back? Unfortunately, you can't. You can't unring that bell. That information is going to be living on the black market for over 3 years, especially if it's interesting personal identifiable information. So if it's social security numbers, credit card numbers, that stuff's going to get sold and resold again on the black market for years. Just recently, 198 million voters, their information was exposed, including social security numbers, voting preferences, race, etc. And just think about how that information can be weaponized and used against you, not just for monetization, but for perhaps a more sophisticated attack. So again, this should really paint the picture that we really got to do better at being able to detect the data breach, because unfortunately, it is truly a matter of time between now and the time that you experience a data breach. It's not an if, it is truly a when. And to give you some examples of people that have been on the wrong side of this, here's some pretty big names, right? So Target, one of the biggest data breaches in history. Office of Personnel and Management, highly regulated government organization. Home Depot, another very large data breach. I think the most interesting thing about this slide is not so much the big names that are on here, although these are, obviously marquee brands, very large companies with significant budgets. The more interesting component of this is that every one of these organizations has some sort of compliance mandate, whether that be in the case of Target or Home Depot or TJX or Heartland, PCI, or the Payment Card Industry Standard, which means that they've got to encrypt and protect personally identifiable information like credit card numbers, which they didn't, or in the case of Office of Personnel and Management, FSMA, again, a very tightly regulated sort of organization that's an actual law that they have to be compliant with. So at some point in time, in order for any of these organizations to be in business, they had to be compliant. They had to attest that, yes, we've done the job of security, we're compliant, we checked that box, and they still suffered a major data breach. So the question that always begs for me is, are we looking at this wrong? Are we thinking about compliance, as a more important facet of this versus security? And I think that's truly one of the reasons why we got to where we're at today. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But again, I want to leave you on this slide thinking to yourself, if organizations that have these millions of dollars budget for IT and for information security aren't able to do this right, what hope do I have? Don't be hopeless. There are some ways to actually solve this problem, at least protect yourself or mitigate that risk down to a manageable amount. There are ways to do it. So if you take the right steps, you will not wind up on this screen. Okay, so some evolving threats. This is what's coming out most recently, stuff that's again, keeping me up at night. We see first thing there, IoT DDoS, and if that's too jargony for you, what that means is Internet of Things, distributed denial of service. So the Internet of Things is everything from a smart TV to a light bulb that has an IP address that you can control via an app on your phone. There are even refrigerators that have IP addresses now. Printers, everything like that that's a specialized device that is capable of doing some computing or has an IP address for the purposes of remote management. There are botnets out there right now that are attacking those and making use of them to perform denial of service attacks. And if denial of service is a term you're not familiar with, what it really means is a group of machines that are working together to overwhelm some target just by sending a huge amount of traffic to it, or perhaps sending malicious traffic to it. That's called a botnet when many of those organizations or many of those compromised devices get together with a single target. And that botnet that I'm describing here is Mirai. Mirai was one of the most interesting botnets of recent memory because it took use of Philips light bulbs and a variety of other kind of what you would consider to be dumb devices, but used those light bulbs to perpetrate one of the biggest denial of service attacks in history, which I think is, again, just incredible. You think, you're looking at your light bulbs thinking they could be, cyber threats, but that's really the case, and that's why this is an evolving threat. I think that's only going to get worse as more and more people adopt stuff like smart toasters or smart refrigerators, or their thermostats are IP'd. Or if you think about it, take that next logical step to something which is perhaps even scarier, which I have seen recently, is medical devices, which are specialized Internet of Things devices like insulin pumps or pacemakers. I read a really interesting research paper very recently about pacemakers having many thousands of vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And if you think about ransomware encrypting files and you have to pay a ransom to get your files back, imagine what kind of ransom you'd be willing to pay if your pacemaker gets shut off and you've got 60 seconds to pay a ransom before you expire. So that's the next logical leap, and I'm personally a little bit frightened of that, and I think it's going to be not too far off in the future. We see ransomware and crimeware. I explained what those were earlier, but exploit kits like Angler are very dangerous. These are prepackaged tools which you can go and purchase on the dark web for anywhere from a couple hundred to $100,000 that do a variety of things. It can be very sophisticated, very well-developed applications and suites that have the initial compromise vector. They have the payloads to drop, backdoors or Trojans onto machines, and they also have code that will allow them to perpetrate denial of service attacks. They're kind of like the Swiss Army knife for the bad guys, and they're out there for purchase. What's, I think, again, scary about that is that the usage of those tools requires very little sophistication. Of course, developing them required quite a lot of funding and quite a lot of sophistication, but usage of them, the bad guys have made these things really easy to use. They're very user-friendly, and that should be frightening because that means anybody that has a desire to do this and has the money to go and purchase the tool requires requires no training to actually put it together. The other thing about that is you can also rent crimeware kits, and you could rent compromised machines that have been compromised by Angler from the bad guys, and then use them for whatever your purposes are, whether that be mining information or, again, using a denial of service attack against somebody else for some period of time. You can time slice it and just buy, an hour block of compromised machine time. Again, evolving threats. Cyber warfare, again, I think this is an area that we're going to see continued development in. I think it's pretty clear that the 2016 election cycle had quite a lot of this cyber warfare going on. Regardless of what spin you choose to believe, the intelligence community definitely attributes the Democratic National Committee hack to an APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat. In this case, it was Cozy Bear. Cozy Bear is the colloquial name for the Russian intelligence service, and there are many organizations around the world that do use cyber attacks in a cyber warfare sort of manner. Advanced persistent threat might be a term you're not familiar with. That's APT. So what that really means is that they've got a high level of sophistication and a lot of resources to throw at a problem. They're persistent, and they're going to find some specific target and go after it and not stop until they get it, and they're a threat. So they're going to use malicious tactics whenever and wherever possible to achieve a goal, whether that be a political goal or a monetization goal. All comers are welcome in those cases. There are many APTs out there. We've named a couple here: Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear, APT29. There are others, and I think recently you saw, if you're following the news for cyber security, a group called the Shadow Brokers released the cyber warfare tools of our own U.S. government, including the CIA via what's called the Vault 7 leaks. And then also via the NSA's Equation Group leaks. That's really interesting because those tools in the wrong hands can be very, very dangerous. And we saw that play out on a global scale via WannaCry, which took use of one of the exploits that was developed by the NSA in the Equation Group toolkit. And again, was used to pretty good effect to compromise a lot of machines. Interestingly, didn't generate a lot of money, but there's some reasons around that that are perhaps too nuanced to get into here. But one way or another, this threat's going to continue to evolve. And one thing that I always let people know, or at least try to express, is that technology changes rapidly, but cyber is probably the fastest moving area within technology, because the bad guys are always trying to maintain that edge. And it's really a reactive sort of approach that the good guys have to try to keep up. That's the goal. Try to keep up. And try to get one step ahead of them if you can, but that's a really hard thing to do because, again, these organizations, APT specifically, are very well resourced, very organized, and they spend a lot of time and effort putting these attack tools together. So how do we try to keep ourselves safe with this sort of threat out there? There are some ways. Again, we're going to get onto those a little bit later here. But first, I want to talk about how we got to where we're at today. There's quite a lot of things that have happened over the past 20 or 30 years that I think have contributed to the situation we're currently in, and I want to dive into that, hopefully dispel some myths, because I think that that is the misconceptions that are out there, perhaps what are causing the big problem right now, if you think root cause analysis. So what are some of those misconceptions? First and foremost, I see this so frequently, the "I'm not a target" misconception. It doesn't really matter if you are or not. I think that's the simplest way to put it. Even if you're not a target, who cares? If you're targeted or not, if you end up breached, the net result is the same. It doesn't matter whether or not you were some specific target or just unlucky. And being unlucky is probably a whole heck of a lot more common than being a target. But if you're thinking to yourself, well, nobody's out to get me, I'm not on anybody's list, please put that thought aside. Does not matter. If you get a phishing attack that's not targeting you specifically, but you happen to click the link accidentally, or somebody within your organization accidentally clicks the link, it really doesn't matter whether you're targeted or not. You're still breached. And think about, if you did have a significant data breach, depending upon what sort of organization you're in, would you guys make a headline? Potentially, right? You'd probably have to notify some clients that their information was exposed, and that's something which is not a fun conversation to have. There's some significant reputation impacts in addition to that $4 million per breach average cost. So again, please, if you're thinking nobody's out to get me, I don't have to worry about this, set that aside. It's even if it's true, it doesn't matter. You still have to prepare yourself, expect the worst, and plan for it. So another one misconception that has conspired to create the situation we're in is this reactionary approach. And the way that I hear this told to me more often than not is, well, I've never had an incident before, so I don't have anything to worry about. Well, first and foremost, number one, you probably don't know that you've never had an incident before, or that you did and you didn't realize it. And then secondly, you're waiting for the horse to leave the barn to shut the barn door, and that's not a good approach, right? You have to protect yourself as much as you possibly can, because it's going to be way more costly if you take that reactionary approach. If you wait until after the worst has happened to do something about it, you're going to be in a pretty bad position. So it's much better to think this through ahead of time. Do all of the prevention controls, do all of the detection controls so you can tell when you've been breached, and then attempt to put together a containment and eradication plan via a good incident response capability. You remember there's only 10% of organizations that have a good information response capability, and most of the time you don't know that something happened for months. So if you're waiting for that phone call from your IT guy to say, hey, we had a data breach, to do something about it, or to assign or allocate funds or put some resources towards security, you're going about it wrong, and it's going to bite you in the end, I promise you. So think proactively versus reactively. Another thing I pretty frequently see is a lack of strategic focus. And what that really means is that people take a very tactical, technical approach to cybersecurity. They think, okay, I'm going to buy this latest, greatest, next-gen firewall, and my problems are solved. Or they're going to buy that and then don't fully enable all of the cool features that come with it. Don't put the spam filter on. They don't put the web content filter on. And at that point in time, it's just a big expensive box. It's not really doing what it needs to do. But this isn't this slide's not really meant to talk about firewall specifically, but just really that tactical approach and thinking about the big picture. With respect to your organization is critical for cybersecurity. Cyber, you may have heard this term before, or this phrase, but it's not just a technical problem. It's definitely a business problem, and it's a risk that needs to be managed at the board level. And fortunately, we are seeing more push towards strategically managing cyber risk at board and executive levels. But a lot of organizations still just look at it as a technical problem that they delegate to their IT team, and I think again that's really missing the focus. You have to build a program around it. You have to build a cyber program which includes all those technical controls, but also incorporates the other stakeholders in the organization, both financial, business operations, etc. And you've got to build the process to support that program, because it's not just about buying the antivirus software, buying the firewall. It's about putting all those pieces together into a layered, meshed approach to solve the problem. And that really requires some strategic thought. If it's not something that you feel comfortable doing, there are some outside consultants that can help with that. Certainly TruShield is one of them. I mentioned this earlier. So we frequently see this focus on compliance instead of security. And I think this actually is much to the detriment of the industry as a whole. People have had it drilled into their heads since time immemorial that they've got to be compliant, must be compliant. I got to be compliant with, PCI or HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or something, and that's the gold standard. I get to that and my job is done. The truth really is compliance really should be thought of as a product of doing security right. If you're doing security right, then you're going to be compliant. If you're compliant, you might not necessarily be secure. And I showed you some examples of organizations earlier that were quote unquote compliant, but at the end of the day, not secure. Don't put the cart before the horse. Think about security. If you do security right, compliance is going to come out of that, and that's going to include, all the access control stuff you got to be worried about, all the encryption standards that you got to be worried about, all of the remote access VPN stuff will all be taken care of if you think about security first, and then allow compliance to come out of that effort, that holistic program effort, rather than just that tactical, I got to check this compliance box approach. It's really dangerous to think about it as compliance being the finish line. In my opinion, I think compliance should really be your starting line, right? You've got to be compliant to be in business, but you can't stop there. You've got to be thinking about security and doing security correctly. And I don't want to undersell this because it's important. If you're in an organization that has to be compliant, yes, of course, you must attest that you're compliant, but focus on doing security first and then compliance as the output of that process. So I think I read a report from Gartner recently that something like 60% of budget is allocated towards prevention controls. And prevention controls, it's kind of what's written on the box, basically trying to stop the attack from happening. So there are some ways that you can do that. You can install a good firewall, try to stop the attack at the network edge, configure your rules, and then hope for the best. You can also, install antivirus and anti-malware. Hopefully you're doing this, and update your signatures, and again, cross your fingers and hope for the best. The problem with that is what I showed you on the slide, many slides ago at this point, was that there are thousands of compromises that happen every year, and perhaps tens of thousands, and nobody's perfect at the end of the day. And since cybersecurity moves so quickly and it's such an evolving threat, it's really not possible for a prevention tool to be perfect. Right? Nobody is perfect. There's no single tool or process or service that you can buy that's going to prevent everything. Even if 0.00001% of the attacks actually make it through because you've got a really good prevention capability, still that 0.0001% is something you got to manage and something you got to be worried about. So you can't just rely upon prevention and cross your fingers. You've got to be thinking about detection and thinking about containment and eradication. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, about where we're going, but an over-reliance upon prevention has definitely been an issue. So if you're in an organization that you've said this or had somebody tell you, well, we've got a good firewall or we've got antivirus, I don't have to worry about that. Again, that's a misconception, and I hope to dispel that myth here. You still have to think about what do we do about the few things that make it through that prevention. I also see a lot of organizations think about security as a point-in-time project. I've got to get, and this actually ties pretty close in hand to the compliance issue. They think maybe I've got to be compliant, so I've got to put together this project plan, execute it, and then I'm done. And that's really not the case. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this threat landscape is changing constantly, and that means that you've got to be in a continuous improvement loop with respect to your cybersecurity in order to actually keep up with it. If you just take a point-in-time snapshot via either a single penetration test or maybe by doing a vulnerability scan and fixing the problems, that's only going to tell you how well you were doing at that moment in time, and not really whether or not you're able to keep up. And so you've got to be doing this stuff continuously. You've got to think about it as a life cycle. Put together a roadmap with perhaps a multi-year sort of picture, and then take trend lines and think about how well we're doing over time. Are we improving as an organization? Are we reducing risk overall, or do we just do that job that one time and then forgot about it? And hopefully you didn't, because that means that you're probably just 210 days away from being notified that you've been breached. Don't think of security as a project. Think of it as a continuous process that you've got to continue to do throughout time, and you'll be a little bit better off. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're going, and again, hopefully this will put you guys on the right path towards achieving some security, or towards achieving the the goal of protecting yourself and protecting your client information. And there are many approaches that some work better than others. I'm going to talk about a few things that I think will certainly help improve your security. You implement these, or think about how you can implement these within your organization, and you'll be in much better shape than you were prior to listening to this webinar today. So there are some tools out there that can actually work on addressing those evolving threats. So I mentioned earlier firewalls and antivirus with signatures. If you're not really familiar with that term or what a signature is, so basically every time a new virus gets found or discovered on the internet, the antivirus companies write some fingerprint for that particular threat and then load it into their database. So the next time they see it, it's going to fire off a signature alert, and you're going to have the alert pop up or the thing blocked. The problem with that is, since it's continuously changing and kind of constantly new stuff is being developed to being used against you, that means that there's always a chance that some new attack or new virus, for instance, that hasn't been seen before or that hasn't had a signature written for it gets used against you. That's sometimes called a 0 day if there's no new signature for it, or it's a vulnerability that hasn't yet been disclosed to the vendor, so they don't have a patch for it. That means that you're not going to be able to prevent it. So what's the better approach there, or at least to use in collaboration with signatures, is behavior-based security tools. So what that means is if these tools, which are relatively newer, are configured to look for stuff that's different, maybe not necessarily something that's been seen before, but some difference, some maybe traffic pattern which is different than that's occurred within an organization, or perhaps some user activity that's different than that particular user has been observed doing. That means that there's something there that needs to be investigated, or something that could potentially be malicious or is at least suspicious. And so what these tools will do is fire off an alert to your security operations center or perhaps to your IT person, and at least let you know that there's something different going on that this tool hasn't seen before, so it's probably worth doing some investigation on. You couple that with the signature-based approach, and you're actually in pretty good shape. You're at least a lot better off than if you just rely upon signatures, certainly much better off if you don't even have signature sort of controls. Another thing that we're also seeing is security in the network. We work with a number of ISPs that have built carrier-level security technology wherein they're able to scrub traffic before it actually arrives at their client site. And some really interesting developments in that sort of arena, wherein you can actually use the network as your network edge. So what I mean by that is the ISP owns all of the copper fiber of the actual internet, and there are ways that you can put sensors and technical controls on that network at the carrier level to prevent bad things from being traversed throughout. And there are some ISPs that are probably a little bit more ahead than others with respect to this. We've done quite a lot of work with one in particular, level 3 communications, that has a pretty good capability of security in the network. Adaptive security controls are really similar to this whole concept here, wherein they're trying to keep up with the bad guys and adapting to their techniques. So we see a new threat, the security tool adapts to recognize that threat via some behavior-based technology, and then implement some orchestration to go and make a change within the network to prevent that attack from being successful. That does rely upon some machine learning or some artificial intelligence to just observe what's going on, develop a baseline over time, and then take automated, orchestrated sort of responses to those sort of attacks. I think you're going to see security orchestration continue to be a very growing area of the market. And what I mean by that is that all that automated mitigation, automated remediation stuff that you should be rely upon your tools to help you with. If you don't have those tools, then there are some service providers that can help with that. Again, TruShield being one of those. So there are some pitfalls that we hope you don't fall into. And that really revolves around what I call the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity. Get the basics right. And you got to patch your systems, you got to be doing vulnerability scanning, and you've got to be fixing the problems that you uncover. I can't stress this enough. We've done some research on this, and something like 70% of data breaches relied upon exploitation of some vulnerability that there's a patch for. And what that means is if you just kept up with patches, if you just updated your system when new security alerts came out, or scanned for vulnerabilities regularly and fix them, then you're going to stop 70% of the potential attack fallout. So that right there is something most organizations really fail to do correctly or do adequately, and it's unfortunate because it's something which is certainly within your power to do. So if you're within an organization that doesn't do regular vulnerability scanning, we'd recommend you do it monthly or more frequently than that. I think a lot of organizations don't achieve that mark. Some maybe do it once a year. Some do it once a quarter. I think that's not frequent enough because vulnerabilities are continuously being discovered and exploited, and you've got to be able to keep up with it. So try to do vulnerability scans once a month at least, and then fix the problems that you uncover when you do vulnerability scans. Again, if you don't have a vulnerability scanning capability, there are some service companies that can help you with that. Again, TruShield being one of them. But the patching and updating of your systems, that's something you got to try to keep up with. And what I observe is a lot of organizations able to keep up with things like Windows updates or Office product updates, but are not doing things like third-party applications like Adobe or Flash or Java. And there are a lot of exploits out there that really take advantage of that fact that it's hard to keep up with that stuff, or that most organizations don't, and so they exploit them. I think one of the more frequent, or at least growing frequency of attacks really comes down to browser plugins. So like all of your Chrome plugins or your Firefox plugins, like Adobe Reader, for instance, very commonly exploited. Because it's difficult for the organization to keep up with it, and the user can typically install those plugins without the administrator's involvement. So there's probably a lot of stuff in your environment that you're not keeping up with patching. And that's a problem because, again, the bad guys know that, and all it really takes is for your user to browse the wrong website that's got some malicious code built into it, which is designed to exploit that user's browser totally without their knowledge, totally without triggering any antivirus alarms. Then from there, that machine's owned, and you can pilfer personally identifiable information or use it, again, in a denial of service attack. And at the end of the day, if the organization had just kept up with patching, then it wouldn't have happened. So those thousands of data breaches that you see, 70% of those tie back to somebody didn't patch something they should have. So get that right, and you're going to be in a lot better shape than the majority of the world. And you should also operate under the assumption that you either have been breached or you will be soon. This is, again, ties back to those misconceptions I talked about earlier, the I'm not a target misconception, or I've never had a problem before, or why do I need to worry about this now? You really should be operating under this assumption because it's just a matter of time. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a very savvy technical person or not, you probably are. Not every user on your network is, though, and it just takes one of those individuals to, again, click the link in the email or browse the wrong web page accidentally, and your entire organization could be locked up via ransomware. Or you could have something even more malicious that basically is designed to just steal information from you without you knowing about it. Ransomware is interesting because it blows up in your face and says, hey, I'm here, do something about me. The average threat really doesn't do that. It tries to fly under the radar. And that's, I think, the more concerning one because it's going to take you months to figure that out that happened. If you operate under the assumption that you've been breached or you will be soon, what that's going to do is help foster a culture of security within your organization. And that's a really important thing. And if the executive team, the board is thinking under this perspective that it's a matter of time, then they're going to start doing things right. They're going to start thinking about allocating budget to security. They're going to think about performing those regular vulnerability scans and requiring reporting on how well we're doing over time. Those little things, they may not seem like much, but they add up, and that sort of security culture gets manifested with users that are a lot more aware of risks, that are trained on how to deal with risk, organizations that have good incident response process because they're thinking, I'm going to be breached, I better prepare for that, and so they've put together an incident response plan and they've tested it, or again, they've contracted with some outsourced company to help them manage these risks. And if you're not thinking under this sort of paradigm that it's likely or just a matter of time before I have this problem, then you're kind of sticking your head in the sand and kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. And unfortunately, I promise you that's not the right approach. You're going to wind up on that wall of shame if you don't follow this advice. Another thing to think about is that strategic focus I mentioned earlier. I talked about a holistic program that ties together the technical and the non-technical controls and thinks about it as a business problem. These frameworks are a really great way of helping foster that. And there are many that are out there. I've listed a handful here. We've got NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They've developed an entire series of publications called the SP 800 series that are designed to help federal organizations implement security controls within their networks, but they can be used in any organization, whether or not you're federal. And they're a pretty good tool to use because they're very rigorous and require you to think about the many different aspects of cybersecurity. Now you may be thinking NIST is way over my head, or it's just way too rigorous for my organization. That could very well be the case, and it's really incumbent upon you to think about what the business problems are and what framework works best. Some other examples I can give for frameworks are obviously the PCI Data Security Standard, Payment Card Industry DSS. There's a great control set built around that, which is designed to help organizations that process credit card information or card information to protect that PII. That can be extended to any sort of information. So if you think about how do you protect sensitive information, PCI is a pretty good one. Another one which we typically recommend organizations use when they don't know which framework to use is the SANS 20 critical security controls. I don't have it listed here, but what I think is really nice about the SANS 20 is that it includes the 20 most important controls you should have in your organization and then maps it back to things like HIPAA, NIST, PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. So if you're required to be compliant with any of those and you don't know where to begin, start with the SANS 20 critical security controls, and then you can map it back to the framework that you've actually got to be compliant with. But if you start working towards the goal of adopting one of these frameworks, again, that's going to put you on the right track. It's going to start fostering that corporate culture of security that's important, and it's going to also foster that process-oriented approach that you can tie these different technical controls together to ensure that you're taking that lifecycle approach and you've got a documented and well orchestrated sort of program that strategically focuses on solving business risks and not just on that tactical, I've got to buy an antivirus tool. That's again the wrong approach. These frameworks are a lot broader based than that, and will force you to think about the problem from a business perspective. So do that and put these this sort of framework together. That's going to, again, force you to do security right. Compliance is going to come out of it because you're going to map it back to the compliance mandates you've got to be tied to, and then you're, again, going to be in much better shape moving forward from there. Additionally, so I mentioned earlier that there's an over-reliance upon prevention. I remember I talked about firewalls and antivirus, and many organizations that we talk to say, I bought the latest, greatest firewall, or I've got this really cool antivirus tool, so I don't have to worry about this. You know, unfortunately, that's just not the case. You have to be thinking about detection and response, because again, even if you have the best prevention tools in the world, you know, if that 0.0001% gets through, you still have to be able to do something about it. So you've got to be able to detect something bad has happened. And remember, again, 4 out of 5 organizations cannot detect that they've been compromised. Those that can, it takes months to. So if you get better there, if you can try to draw that timeline down, if you remember, it just takes a couple of hours for the bad guys to steal 60% of your data. If you can detect it before that happens, which is possible, then you're going to be in much better shape than if you just relied upon your prevention tools. So think about how do you continuously monitor your network? If it's not something that's a capability you've got, again, there are service companies that can help with that. TruShield being one of them, with a 24/7 continuous security monitoring service that we offer. But it's something you have to be thinking about doing. Whether or not you do it in-house or not isn't entirely within your sort of decision matrix, but you have to be doing something about it. You got to be monitoring for intrusions, and then you really, truly, even if you don't do any of the above, you have to have an incident response plan. You have to think about who are the stakeholders for incidents. Do we have to loop in business operations? Do we have to loop in legal? Do we have to loop in, obviously, your technical team to try to close it down? Probably senior leadership needs to know about an incident that occurs, because you may have to communicate with clients that their information was exposed. And if you wait until the worst has happened before thinking about this stuff, you're going to be running around like a chicken with its head cut off. So do the drafting of the incident response plan. It's going to help you much more quickly react to a threat that actually blows up in your environment. Test it regularly. I've seen a lot of people draft an incident response plan and just put it on the shelf and don't think about it. And then 3 years later, when they go to try to execute it, it's an entirely different staff, or the technical platforms are no longer in existence, and it's a useless tool at that point. It's basically shelfware. So you got to test it regularly, update it at least once a year. And more frequently if you have changes within your network, or if you bring in perhaps a third party like some cloud service platform, for instance. Really important to do this stuff, because this is, again, thinking strategically. If we know that there's a likelihood that there's going to be a data breach, if we're operating under the assumption that we're going to be breached, then I for damn sure better well be able to detect it and then do something about it when it actually happens. You do all this stuff, then compliance, again, becomes the output of security. And I think, from my perspective, that's so much the better approach. I can't even express it, because, again, if you're focused on just checking the compliance boxes, and at the end of the day you're looking at it as that I got to get compliant project, and not thinking strategically, you're just taking that tactical, check-the-box approach, you're going to be in bad shape. If you do security correctly and think about all those things I talked about earlier, either adopting a framework, shifting the focus to detection, thinking about the evolving threats and how the bad guys are getting better day over day, then and addressing that stuff, then you're going to be compliant. You're going to have thought the problem through, and you're going to, by virtue of adopting one of those frameworks, be able to say, yes, I'm compliant. Here's my documentation supporting that, and oh, by the way, we're actually protecting our clients too, because I know each control by control what it is that we're doing, and it's sufficient to meet the need of our data security standards. Compliance then, again, becomes a product of it, and much better position to be in. You won't wind up on the wall of shame as easily if you do it that way. If you take a proactive approach, again, this is just like earlier, a direct output of that operating under the assumption that you're going to be breached. You're going to be able to think ahead. Think, what do I need to be doing to protect myself from the worst happening, versus taking the reactive approach after something bad has happened. You've dispelled that myth that you're not a target, or that nothing bad has happened to you, so you don't have to worry about it. And you're thinking, what do I need to do to protect myself, prevent the worst from happening as much as I can, but again, making sure that I can detect when that 1 in a billion does get through, and then do something about it. And you're taking a proactive approach, and you're not waiting for the grenade to blow up in your hand before you throw it. So much better to do it this way. Again, if you remember earlier, I said that waiting for the worst to happen, something like 10 times as costly as taking the proactive approach. So if you wait for something to happen, you're going to have an incident cost, which could be $4 million on average, and that's going to be a lot more costly than just having had done it right in the first place. So much better to think forward. Again, adopt one of those frameworks, think about it strategically as a whole program, and then move forward with it with a plan. Proactivity is much better than reactivity. I mentioned earlier that security as a project doesn't work. You've got to think of it as a continuous life cycle of improvement, and you want to learn from each step along the way. So the bad guys are going to be learning from their mistakes. You should as well. If you implement a control, let it operate, do some reporting on it in terms of process efficiency, feedback back into the process, and learn and take lessons learned, continuously get better, then you're going to be looking at it as a life cycle, and you're going to be improving over time, hopefully as rapidly as the bad guys are improving their attack tactics over time. They're going to be watching what you're doing. They're going to be learning from your mistakes as well as their own, and they're going to try to get better over time. You better as well, because if you can't keep up, then again, you're going to wind up on the wall of shame. Don't want to be there. And that's the end of the content today. So I hope you found this webinar to be informational. Again, I mentioned at the beginning that it's a scary world out there, but truly do believe that if you implement some of the suggestions that we made here, you're going to be able to prevent a lot of bad things from happening, or at least detect when they have happened and close them down really quickly. And that should be the goal for everybody here. This threat's not going away anytime soon. It's just going to get worse. You're going to see more and more headlines because it's so much money is being generated by the bad guys right now that there's significant organized crime interest in cybercrime. That's not going to change anytime soon. So again, you have to be doing something about it. Don't stick your head in the sand. Don't think I'm not a target or I've never had something bad happen to me before. Operate under the assumption that you're going to be breached, and then take some proactive steps to do something about it before it happens. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm available on Twitter, LinkedIn, or email. If you have any questions about services that TruShield offers, you can reach us on that 800 number there, or at info@trueshieldinc.com. I would also invite you to come to our website and take a look at what it is that we do. Additionally, follow us on LinkedIn, because again, we do frequently publish content related to cybersecurity attacks and prevention tactics on LinkedIn. And if you have an interest in keeping up with what's going on in the world of cyber, that's a great place to start. So again, hope you found this informational today, and thank you for attending.